Good day, Grinder School. Today we're going to go through part 1 of the How to Master Heads-Up Sit and Go's video, starting with an introduction to the series. So, starting out with the scope, this is a base introduction starting fairly much from the ground up. Obviously, having some experience playing any sort of hold'ems, whether it's in tournament or cash games, will definitely be an asset and make it easier to understand the concepts. We're going to be concentrating on the turbo structure. On stars specifically is what I'm basing this on, but it's relatively standard across the board to some degree. And since most of the plays are based on effective stacks, it can be applied to any sort of structure that has a starting level of 75 big blinds, and even larger stack structures will pretty much have a lot of similarities with this, so that's one of the reasons why I picked this structure. And the video series is going to start very straightforward with very little fancy plays or bluffs in general, and it's going to work its way up into understanding why we make fancier plays or more aggressive plays. So the series is going to be 8 videos. It's also going to have 2 podcast components. The videos are going to be starting with this introduction, and then in part 2 we're going to go over a basic strategy, which is basically going to go over starting hands, a really basic 3-betting strategy, and some ideas on the structure and how things will change throughout the blind levels. In part 3 we're going to go through betting, specifically bet sizing at the various stack levels, as well as continuation bets and situations where we will change our continuation bets based on structure and occasionally opponent, as well as limping strategies, which are not going to be used in our basic strategy, and why we will adapt the limping strategies, and donk betting as well. Part 4 we're going to start getting into adaptive strategy. We're going to start talking about 3-bet bluffing ranges and adapting to opponent tendencies. In part 5, which is also going to be a short, we're going to start talking about reasons why we use aggression and how to properly apply it. We're going to go over things in that, including overbetting and underbetting, as well as trying not to overrep our hands in situations, and also the importance of basically not spewing off our stacks in these structures, and when it's correct to barrel, even triple barrel your whole stack. So the pluses and minuses of being overly aggressive in these structures. In part 6 we're going to continue on with an adaptive strategy, talking more and more about adapting to very specific player tendencies, as well as a couple of advanced strategies. And in part 7 we're going to talk about the Nash equilibrium and the Chubukov chart, and we'll get into a lot of common misconceptions about those charts and how to properly use them. And then we'll get into more advanced endgame strategies in part 8. So by the end of these 8 videos, we're going to lead from a very straightforward strategy that has next to no bluffing or 3-betting, but it's still profitable at a really low stake game, and work in more aggressive and more effective betting habits, and most importantly an adaptive strategy that adapts to the tendencies of our opponents, but also a really aggressive end game that takes advantage of just mathematics and opponent tendencies as well. So the primary objective really when you're trying to play heads up is to adapt to our opponents as much as possible, and against superior villains start playing more of a merged range type strategy. So in addition to these videos, I highly recommend that people supplement it if they don't have an understanding of equity calculations already with Code Red's 36th and 38th video. Those both cover equity calculations, and basically, even though I'm not going to go through a lot of the math in these videos, every decision I make is essentially based on equity calculations, either maximizing fold equity or simply trying to get value, or calling with marginal hands simply because of low stack to pot ratio at lower stacks. So having a really good understanding of equity calculations so that you can make or have a reasonable estimate of what that equity is on the fly is definitely very helpful. And I would say that's true for any form of poker, but more essential in a heads-up format. And also any sort of understanding of board textures, which is relatively straightforward for anybody that's been playing poker for a while, but understanding what makes a wet texture, what makes a dry texture, and that sort of thing. And also hand reading and being able to match your the villain's hand range with boards, etc., is also incredibly useful. Although this is a skill that often just takes time and lots of hands, so if you don't already have decent hand reading skills, they will certainly develop after playing a few thousand Heads-Up Sit and Goes. So at the end of this video series, our goal is to be able to play a very adaptive game. Like I mentioned before, the whole the way you effectively play any heads-up game is you adapt to your opponent's tendencies and try to take advantage of them in any sort of way. So unfortunately, there's no simple formula that works against all opponents, and even though you can easily play relatively non-exploitively, your ROI won't be all that great. And that's where our baseline is going to be, but from there we're going to move up quickly to an adaptive play that takes advantage of villains' tendencies. We're also going to concentrate on a high level of aggression during endgame that takes advantage basically of math and also of player tendencies too, because that's always a concern at all levels in these games. The big end result too is that for those of you that are sit and go players or MTT players, this will result in more first place finishes, which will increase your ROI. And you know, in general, Heads-Up Sit and Goes also help you in blind versus blind play in cash games. I say cash games simply because in Sit and Goes and MTTs you have to take into account ICM, so it changes the play slightly, whereas cash games it's all chip EV, which is very similar to the structure of Heads-Up Sit and Go. And certainly another big advantage to this too, if you haven't played a lot of these, you'll find that heads-up play really increases your ability to hand read and also your ability to make both good laydowns and calls essentially due to hand reading. So hand reading, I think, is probably the biggest benefit that a new player would get from playing these. And in general, I think that it will improve people's poker as a whole. So I highly recommend this structure of Sit and Go to pretty much anybody that plays Hold'em. At least you know, for a bit. So even if you have no intention of playing thousands of these, even if you play a few hundred of them, I think you'll see an immediate benefit to your game if you're a newer player. So I hope that you guys have enjoyed this introduction and the rest of the series as it comes out. Feel free to leave any questions in the forums.